Something killed 3 people from your group last winter. Not a predator, not starvation, not injury from a hunt gone wrong. Something invisible. Something that moved through the camp like a presence, selecting its victims with no apparent logic. The strongest man first, then a child, then an elderly woman who had survived 50 winters without incident. It arrived without warning, stayed for weeks, and left the same way it came. With no explanation. With no cause that anyone could identify, touch, examine, or address. You buried them. You grieved them. And then, inevitably, you started asking the question that human beings have been asking since before we had adequate language to ask it properly. Why? Not why in the epidemiological sense. Not the germ theory of disease, which is several 100,000 years in the future from where you're standing. Why in the deeper sense? Why these 3 people and not others? Why this winter and not last winter? Why does the world work this way, with death arriving randomly, with storms destroying in minutes what took weeks to build, with good seasons following bad ones, and bad seasons following good ones, with no apparent pattern that the most careful observation can reliably decode? Ancient humans were not stupid. They were not primitive. They were not cognitively limited in any way that would prevent them from noticing that the world contained forces and events that exceeded their understanding and their control. And they were not the kind of minds that sat quietly with unanswered questions. They were curious, pattern-seeking, meaning-making creatures. The most cognitively sophisticated organisms on Earth. And they did what sophisticated minds do with the unexplained. They built explanations. The question of whether ancient humans believed in God, or gods, or spirits, or forces, or whatever the right vocabulary is for what they actually believed in, is not a simple yes or no question. It is a question about the nature of ancient human cognition, about the specific psychological mechanisms that produce religious belief, about what the archaeological evidence actually shows, and about what it means to have a concept of the sacred in a world without temples, without scripture, without any of the institutional infrastructure that modern people associate with religion. And the answer is extraordinary. Let's start with the cognitive architecture, because religious belief does not emerge from nowhere. It emerges from specific features of human cognition that are ancient, universal, and operating in ancient human brains in exactly the way they operate in modern ones. The first is what cognitive scientists call the hyperactive agency detection device, or HADD. This is the tendency of human minds to interpret ambiguous events and phenomena as caused by agents, intentional beings with goals, desires, and the capacity to act. It is a detection system tuned toward false positives. It is better to mistakenly perceive agency in a rustling bush and run than to correctly perceive no agency and get eaten by the lion that was actually there. This system does not switch off cleanly at the boundary of the physically plausible. A mind trained to detect agents everywhere it looks tends to continue detecting them even in phenomena that have no actual agent. In storms, in disease, in the movements of celestial bodies, in the unexpected good fortune of a successful hunt, or the inexplicable bad fortune of 3 deaths in a single winter. The ancient human mind, equipped with an agency detection system calibrated for a world full of real agents, projected agency onto events that had none. This is not a flaw in ancient human cognition. It is a feature of human cognition generally, including modern human cognition. The tendency to perceive intentional agency in non-agentive phenomena is documented in modern adults across all studied cultures. It is stronger in children. Children universally attribute intentional causation to natural events before developing more mechanistic explanatory frameworks. It is a cognitive default that requires active effort and specific cultural and educational scaffolding to override, even partially. Ancient humans had no such scaffolding. They experienced the raw cognitive default in full. The second mechanism is theory of mind, the ability to model the mental states of other agents, to understand that other beings have beliefs, desires, intentions, and perspectives that differ from your own. This is one of the most distinctively human cognitive capacities, and it is also implicated in religious belief in a specific way. A mind that can model other minds naturally asks when it perceives agency in a storm or a disease. What does this agent want? What are its beliefs? What would it take to satisfy its desires? The same cognitive system that allows ancient humans to navigate complex social relationships, understanding that your hunting partner has different information than you, that the rival from another group has different motives than you might assume, also allows them to model the presumed mental states of the invisible agents they have detected in the natural world. The combination of HAD and theory of mind produces something that looks very much like the cognitive foundation of religious belief. The perception of invisible, intentional agents in the natural world, combined with the attempt to understand and influence those agents' intentions through the same social strategies used to navigate relationships with visible, embodied agents. Now let's look at the archaeological evidence, because we don't have to rely entirely on cognitive inference. The physical record of ancient human spiritual practice is older, richer, and more unambiguous than most people realize. The oldest evidence of what most researchers agree represents symbolic or ritual behavior. Behavior that implies a framework of meaning beyond the purely practical goes back at least 300,000 years. At a site called Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, ochre, the red iron oxide pigment that appears at ancient sites worldwide, has been found in layers dating to approximately 300,000 years ago in quantities and arrangements suggesting deliberate use beyond any purely functional purpose. At a site in Zambia called Twin Rivers, more than 300 ochre specimens were found, many showing wear patterns consistent with grinding and use as pigment, dating to approximately 300,000 to 400,000 years ago. Red ochre is found at ancient sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia, spanning an enormous time range in quantities and contexts that speak to a persistent, widespread, cross-cultural human practice of using pigment, the most plausible use for which across the full range of contexts where it appears is body decoration and ritual. Why does body decoration matter for the religious belief question? Because ritual body modification, the deliberate transformation of one's physical appearance using symbolic materials, is one of the most direct expressions of symbolic thinking that the archaeological record can document. It implies a mind that understands the difference between how things are and how they can be made to signify, that believes in the power of symbolic action to affect something beyond the immediate physical. The Cima de los Huesos site in Spain, dating to approximately 430,000 years ago, predating our own species, contains the deliberate accumulation of hominin remains in a pit, along with a single red hand axe that appears to have been placed deliberately rather than accidentally deposited. Deliberate disposal of the dead, with deliberate material accompaniment at 430,000 years ago. Whatever the specific belief system of the beings who did this, the behavior implies something we can only describe as ritual. A recognition that the dead required specific treatment, that material objects carried significance in the context of that treatment, that there was a right way to send the dead to wherever they were believed to be going. Let's talk about burials specifically, because ancient burial practice is the richest single archaeological window into ancient belief systems. Deliberate burial of the dead, with grave goods, appears in the archaeological record of both anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals. The presence of deliberate burial in Neanderthals, who diverged from the modern human lineage approximately 500,000 to 700,000 years ago, implies that something recognizable as mortuary ritual predates our own species. The degree of ritual elaboration in Neanderthal burials is debated. Some researchers argue that Neanderthal burials were deliberate but minimally ceremonial, others that they show evidence of more elaborate treatment. What is not seriously debated is that Neanderthals were burying their dead deliberately rather than simply abandoning them. Among anatomically modern humans, the elaboration of burial practice from approximately 100,000 years ago onward is striking. Graves become increasingly complex. They include grave goods, tools, ornaments, ochre, food remains that imply beliefs about what the dead would need after death. They include the physical positioning of bodies in specific orientations, often curled in a fetal position, often facing a specific direction, that implies beliefs about the significance of orientation in whatever journey the dead were understood to be undertaking. The burial site at Sungir in Russia, dating to approximately 34,000 years ago, represents one of the most elaborate ancient burial sites ever found. Two children, a boy and a girl, were buried head to head, covered with thousands of mammoth ivory beads that had been sewn onto their clothing, accompanied by ivory spears, carved animals, fox teeth pendants, and other objects of evident significance. The investment of time and resources represented by this burial, the thousands of beads alone would have required hundreds of hours of work to produce, is only explicable if the people who made it believed that the objects would serve the children in whatever existence followed death. This is not ancestor worship as a sophisticated theological system. This is something more immediate and more personal. The conviction that death is not simply the end, that the dead go somewhere and need things for the journey, that the living have obligations to the dead that must be met through specific acts and specific provisions. This is belief, embodied in behavior, preserved in the ground for us to find tens of thousands of years later. Let's talk about shamanism, because it represents the most directly documented form of ancient spiritual practice and the one most directly connected to the question of what ancient humans believed. Shamanism, broadly defined as a practice in which specific individuals access altered states of consciousness to interact with the spirit world on behalf of their community, is the most widespread religious practice documented in traditional societies globally. It appears in indigenous cultures across Siberia, the Americas, Africa, Australia, and South Asia. Its core features, the specialist practitioner, the deliberate induction of altered states, the belief in a spirit realm accessible through those states, the mediating function between the human community and supernatural forces, are so consistent across cultures with no historical contact that most anthropologists consider them universal features of early human religious practice rather than products of cultural diffusion. The antiquity of shamanic practice is suggested by multiple lines of evidence. The cave art of ancient Europe, particularly the imagery in the deepest, most deliberately accessed chambers of painted caves, shows imagery that many researchers interpret as consistent with shamanistic visionary states. Therianthropic figures, beings that combine human and animal characteristics, appear repeatedly in ancient cave art. These figures are found in shamanic traditions worldwide, where they represent the shaman's spirit helpers, or the being that the shaman becomes during trance. The sorcerer figure at Les Trois Frères in France, approximately 17,000 years old, depicts a human figure with animal characteristics that has been interpreted as precisely this kind of shamanic imagery. The neuroscience of shamanic trance states is relevant here. The altered states produced by drumming, rhythmic movement, extreme fasting, sleep deprivation, and certain plant compounds, the standard toolkit of shamanic practice worldwide, produce specific patterns of activity in the visual cortex that generate consistent visual experiences across individuals regardless of cultural background. Geometric patterns, tunnels of light, therianthropic beings, the sense of flight or dissolution. These experiences are not cultural constructions. They are the products of a specific neurological state, accessible to any human brain subjected to the right combination of inputs. Ancient humans who discovered the techniques for inducing these states, and the techniques are remarkably simple and discoverable, since many of them are essentially side effects of extreme versions of normal survival experiences like starvation and sleep deprivation, would have had the same experiences. They would have perceived beings, presences, and dimensions of reality that are not accessible to ordinary waking consciousness. They would have experienced the dissolution of the boundary between self and world. They would have returned from these states with vivid, emotionally powerful experiences that they would naturally have interpreted as encounters with the invisible agents their HADD was already primed to detect. These experiences were real. Not real in the sense that the beings encountered were objectively present in a physical sense. Real in the sense that the experiences were genuine, vivid, physiologically grounded, and phenomenologically indistinguishable from waking reality to the person having them. The ancient human who experienced a shamanic trance state was not making something up or engaging in wishful thinking. They were having a genuine experience, generated by their own nervous system, interpreted through the explanatory framework available to them, that felt more real, not less than ordinary waking experience. Let's talk about what ancient people believed specifically, because religious belief as a category is too broad and too vague to be useful. The The specific content of ancient belief systems is not directly recoverable from the archaeological record. We cannot read the specific cosmologies, the specific stories, the specific entities that ancient humans believed in. What we can infer from the combination of archaeological evidence and the patterns observed in the most traditional human religious systems still in practice is something about the general character of ancient belief. Ancient belief was almost certainly animistic, the attribution of life force, intention, or spiritual significance to natural entities including animals, plants, rocks, rivers, weather phenomena, and celestial bodies. Animism is the most widespread and arguably the most ancient form of religious orientation documented in traditional societies. It does not require a theology or a cosmology in the formal sense. It requires only the application of the same cognitive system that detects and models agency in other humans. Theory of mind applied to the non-human natural world. An animistic ancient human did not see a river as water moving due to gravity. They saw a river as an entity with its own character, its own moods, its own significance for the community's life. This was not irrationality or confusion. It was the application of the most sophisticated cognitive tools available, the tools for modeling and navigating relationships with other agents, to the most practically important features of the natural world. Understanding the river as an agent to be respected, negotiated with, and responded to appropriately produced behaviors. Caution at flood season, specific crossing points and times, protocols for interaction, that may have had genuine survival value independent of the metaphysical framework that motivated them. Ancient belief was almost certainly relational rather than doctrinal, organized around specific relationships between the human community and specific entities in their immediate landscape rather than around abstract universal principles. The sacred places that appear in the archaeological record, the specific caves that were painted and revisited across generations, the specific landscape features associated with ritual deposits, were not random. They were places where the boundary between the ordinary world and the spirit world was felt to be thin, where encounter with invisible agents was experienced as more accessible, where the community's ritual relationships with the forces governing their lives were maintained. Let's address the philosophical dimension directly, because it is the most interesting part. The question of whether ancient humans believed in God is, in one sense, a category error. The God of monotheistic tradition, omnipotent, omniscient, personal, the creator of the universe, is a concept that developed through specific historical and theological processes over the past few thousand years. It is not the concept that ancient humans would have been working with, because those theological developments had not yet occurred. But the question of whether ancient humans believed in something, in forces, presences, and agents beyond the visible human world, in dimensions of reality accessible through altered states or ritual, practice, in the ongoing significance of the dead, in the power of specific places and specific practices to influence the invisible agencies that governed their lives, that question has a clear answer. They did. The evidence is in the ground. It is in the ochre stains of ritual practice going back 300,000 years. It is in the deliberate burials of Neanderthals and ancient humans alike. It is in the cave art made in total darkness, kilometers into cave systems, by people carrying lamps and accessing spaces they had no practical reason to visit. It is in the graves of children covered with thousands of laboriously produced beads. It is in the consistent, cross-cultural, architecturally stable pattern of shamanic practice documented across every traditional human society ever studied. Ancient humans believed? Not in the specific propositional content of any modern religious tradition. That is a different story, developed over thousands of years of theological refinement. But in the underlying thing that all religious traditions are attempting to articulate, that the visible world is not the whole world, that human life is embedded in a web of relationships that extends beyond the visible community, that there are forces and presences that matter and must be attended to, and that specific practices, ritual, ceremony, altered states, treatment of the dead, are the means by which those relationships are maintained. They believed because they were human, because the cognitive systems that produce belief had theory of mind, the pattern-seeking, meaning-making architecture of the human brain, were fully present and operational in ancient human brains. Because the experiences that feel like encounters with something beyond ordinary reality were accessible to ancient humans through the same neurological mechanisms that make them accessible to modern ones. Because the existential questions that religion everywhere attempts to answer, why do people die? What happens after death? What forces govern the world? How should humans relate to those forces? Were as real and as urgent to ancient humans facing genuine, daily, life and death uncertainty as they are to anyone. The 3 people who died in your camp last winter were not just gone. They went somewhere. Something was responsible. And whatever that something was, however ancient humans in your specific community named it or didn't name it, represented it or didn't represent it, it required a response, a ritual, a relationship, an acknowledgement that the world you could see was not the whole of the world that mattered. That is ancient religion. Not theology, not dogma, not institution. Something older and more immediate and more fundamentally human than any of those things. The recognition, built into the architecture of the human mind, that the world contains more than meets the eye.